our main man, Chris Biderman from the Sacramento Bee, and of course, the host of Candlestick Chronicles. We'll get to some thoughts on what's going on in the NFL and the free agency world for the San Francisco 49ers, including the bizarre story with Eric Hendricks coming up here in just a few minutes. But, Chris, let's talk about the Sacramento Kings, man. Back-to-back wins against two tough teams, the Milwaukee Bucks, the Los Angeles Lakers, and everyone's talking about Keon Ellis, man. What do you think about Keon's recent impact on the Sacramento Kings?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been notable, and what he does is in stark contrast to what somebody like Kevin Huerter doesn't do right now, which is, provide a spark defensively, provide you with a little bit of versatility, physicality, deflections, like those types of things the Kings have lacked overall. And it wouldn't surprise me. Our buddy Kyle Madsen asked Mike Brown after the Bucks game, like, would you ever think about making this Keon Ellis switch to the starting lineup permanent? And Mike said no, but I don't think it would surprise anybody who's watching this team right now. Kings made it to the playoffs, and like, would it surprise anybody if one of the adjustments from game 1 to game 2 or game 2 to game 3 was that Mike Brown shifted Keon Ellis to the starting lineup? Because it takes a little bit of pressure off De'Aaron Fox defensively. He's not going to have to expend as much effort on that end if you have Keon Ellis on the floor. Keon can guard up, like he can guard bigger guys. He can play passing lanes. He can run the floor. And really the biggest question with him has been shooting, and he shot at a pretty reasonable clip. So the Kings generally shy away from playing guys who they think are problematic shooters or liabilities on the offensive end. And Keon's proving that, he's not that while he's getting this run lately. So in terms of, what he brings the Kings, it's something that they've lacked throughout the majority of the season. And, talking to you guys and everyone else about the trade deadline, it was like, well, the Kings could really use some perimeter defense. Well, they're getting that internally from a guy they didn't have to trade for in Keon Ellis right now. So it's definitely a big development for them. And if he can continue shooting well, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he ends up, getting more and more playing time as the playoffs get closer.
Hearing you talk about the playoffs and how maybe in between a game 1 and 2 or 2 and 3, Mike might make the move. It reminded me of that's what the playoffs are about. And I think it was either Channing Frye or Richard Jefferson was on somebody's podcast not too long ago talking about Ty Lue, and they were talking about how the year they won the championship, Ty Lue literally would analyze what that series would call for and would tell these guys whether or not they were going to play. And they all bought in, right? Like whoever it was, let's just say Channing Frye, he was just like, against Boston, they played this way and they did this. And he would go to Richard Jefferson and be like, Rich, this isn't the series for you. Like such and such is going to get a lot of time here. You're going to be mostly on the bench, da-da-da-da. They win that, then they play Atlanta. Goes back to Rich. All right, Rich, they like to play this way. This is going to be the series for you. You're going to see your minutes pick up a lot. Channing, you're going to be on the bench here because they just kind of play you off the floor. And that's another chess piece that Mike Brown may have now if they can get to the playoffs with Keon Ellis. He can look at Keon and Kevin and say something like that. Like, all right, I think, because of what they do on the perimeter, we're going to go with Keon a little bit in this series because of his defensive ability. Say they change or they get to another round. All right, Kevin, I think you can match up better with these guys, your shooting ability. It requires everybody to be all in, so to speak, and understanding of the situation. But finding a guy like Keon Ellis as somebody that can be productive in your rotation, it just adds to what Mike Brown can do now with different rotations.
Yeah, and to me, like one of the most interesting things about it is you remember early in the season how Keon Ellis first started getting minutes. It was, those blowouts in Houston when De'Aaron Fox was out with that ankle injury, and Mike Brown, like Keon Ellis caught Mike Brown's attention by how he played in garbage time. And I was like, all right, so I'm gonna give Keon a little bit more of a shot now because he showed out in these otherwise meaningless minutes, and then he became part of the mix, and he's been in and out of the rotation since. But that was really the starting point of Keon proving that he's worthy of time on the floor. And now, all this time forward, fast forward to March and the playoffs coming up, and the Kings are playing, really good teams with really good players like the Lakers and the Bucks, and Keon's getting all this time. And it's like you can trace it back to then. And so it's just one of those things where it's like even in a game in November when somebody's getting blown out and it seems like it's garbage time, maybe that can be the genesis of something bigger, like with Keon here. So I think it's definitely an interesting story that's happened with the Kings so far this season.
And the key to the whole thing, both with him and Davion, is both of them, Chris, seem to have gotten, seem to be for Keon, seem to have gotten for Davion really comfortable on the offensive end.
Yeah, they seem in rhythm. And that's really the question. Like I got, when you go back to what I said earlier, like Mike Brown is hesitant to give minutes to guys who he thinks are liabilities offensively. It's like when you're playing with Domantas Sabonis and you're playing 4 out, you have to be able to shoot. And so he says it to everybody. He says it to Davion. He says it to anybody who's on the floor. If you take shots within the rhythm of the offense and we're spraying threes and it's not just a bunch of dribbling into a contested shot, like if it's a catch and shoot shot, we want you to shoot that. You have to shoot those shots. And Davion, to his credit, despite the numbers being whatever they've been, and despite being in and out of the rotation, he's still taking those shots. And even last night, he's taken a few shots off the dribble still. But I think it's a credit to, it's a credit to the system. Like it's a credit to Mike Brown telling these guys, hey, you might be shooting 25% or whatever it is from 3, but we still need you to fire it up because that's just what our offense is. And so if the Kings offense is playing in rhythm and they're driving and they're spraying the ball and it's not sticking to one guy and there's not a whole lot of dribbling happening, then everybody on the floor can get in that rhythm. And then that's what you see, when they hit a bunch of threes against the Bucks, it feels like everybody's in rhythm. The passing, there's a certain flow to the offense that exists as opposed to, when the ball's sticking and guys are trying to drive and create offense on their own. It's really a team-oriented offensive game plan, and that's when they're playing their best. And you're seeing Keon and Davion buy into that as time goes on.
We've been having some discussion about it the last couple of days, really. But after he goes 6-0, we got to talk about it some more. Say Kevin Huerter is ready to go on Saturday and ready to play, ready to get back in the starting lineup. Do you keep him in the starting lineup, or do you make the switch to put Keon there as your starting 2 guard?
Man, given that it's Jalen Brunson, or is he back? Is Jalen Brunson going to be available?
Yeah.
So if you have Jalen Brunson on the floor, I would be inclined to play Keon. Just because, and Mike always says it, and we all believe this to be true, right? It's not necessarily who starts, it's who finishes. But I would definitely give Keon that look just for, just so you don't have to have De'Aaron Fox, expending a ton of energy on the defensive end, trying to slow him down. And, you could put him on OG Anunoby, somebody who's a little bit more stationary, right? So I would, I'm intrigued by what Keon Ellis brings just because it is different. And it's been what sort of everybody's been calling for in terms of, improvements the Kings need to make on, perimeter defense and those types of things. So I would do it. And I think, the Kings generally, they lack a little bit of depth. I don't know that Kevin Huerter is necessarily a small forward, but it seems like Harrison Barnes and Keegan Murray are the team's only like true small forwards who they play, who are in the rotation. If you move Kevin Huerter to the bench, then maybe you give yourself a little bit more depth that way. I know he is technically a 2 guard, but he is a guy who plays lots of threes in the Kings lineup. So I would be willing to experiment with that at this point. And if it doesn't work, then you can always go back to it, and Kevin Huerter would be comfortable with that. So yeah, I would play Keon. I would, ride the hot hand because it's been working.
Can I say something? I think this Kings related. I think about, remember when I told you earlier, remind me to say something?
Yeah, I even wrote it down and still forgot.
It was Bonte. Did you see Bonte's tweet yesterday?
Oh, Jesus, no.
No. Bonus on that play where he knocked Anthony Davis down to the floor. And Kings Muse said he was looking like he was giving birth.
In labor, yeah.
Not my words, his.
Yeah.
Bonte quote tweets that. He says, nothing empty about this one. Damn.
Oh, wow. Wow. Made Bonte Hill believer. The question is, and I don't think we've mentioned this all day. He had 17, 19, and 10. I don't know that we've talked about Domas and his performance one time in the last 3.5 hours. League leading triple-double. The double-double streak continues. Bonte Hill apparently impressed by Domantas Sabonis. Is Chris Biderman impressed with Domantas Sabonis?
Yeah, I am. Look, like I don't know how I'm painted in terms of my opinion of Domantas Sabonis with you guys, but no, I was impressed. Look, you look at the way Domantas Sabonis has played against Anthony Davis, and he doesn't play with any fear, and he plays with a hell of a lot more physicality than Anthony Davis does. And you would think, given Davis's length, that that's somebody who Sabonis would struggle with, because we've seen him struggle with lengthy defenders in the past, and he just has no problem going right into AD's chest. My question would be like, why doesn't this happen more often? Right. Like just the overall physicality that he's able to play with on both ends, like defensively as well. Like you saw Anthony Davis look timid in some of his shots. Like these aren't, these are shots that Anthony Davis with Domantas Sabonis on him is trying to guide into the basket. It's not like, it doesn't look like a dude who's, a max player who averages 20 and 10 or whatever it is. Like Domantas Sabonis, for whatever reason, is in Anthony Davis's head. And given how good Anthony Davis has been throughout his career on both sides of the floor, it's surprising for me to see him react that way to somebody like Sabonis. That's a credit to Sabonis because he brings a physicality and in my opinion, like you want that more often, not just against Anthony Davis. Like for the Kings to go as far as they want to go, they need that physicality from Sabonis. They need that defensive presence, particularly in the key, right? From Sabonis. And when I look at his game and what is lacking, it's on the defensive end. Sabonis is an amazing offensive player, right? Like he's touching the ball as much as anybody in the league, not named Nikola Jokic. He's an incredible passer. He can finish in the pick and roll. He can do all of those things, but it's on the defensive end when you need to stem the tide of a game, when you need to stop an opponent from scoring. Can your big men protect the rim in a way that we've seen some of the other defensive centers do it in the league? And that's the flaw in Sabonis's game that I keep coming back to. But when it's against AD and he's doing it against AD, yeah, it's super impressive.
Well, I would also say, Chris, who doesn't he do that against? He does that against everybody, both sides of the floor. Who doesn't he do that against?
Valanciunas.
I mean,
Valanciunas might be the one he doesn't.
Zubats with the Clippers.
He just gave him a triple double the last time he played.
Like, but he gave him a triple double. But is Domantas Sabonis? Okay, Domantas Sabonis getting assists and getting rebounds, while Keegan Murray and Harrison Barnes aren't particularly good rebounders. That doesn't mean that he's playing awesome defensively. I don't think anybody with the Kings would look at Domas and say he's our anchor defensively. He's awesome.
Yeah, but so but I would also say, like, that's not Zubats gets 14 points, and we're like, he kills Sabonis. Like, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? Like, what Sabonis does, what Zubac does, quote unquote, to Sabonis is not even close to like what Sabonis does to AD. Like it's not the same. Like we're talking about a Zubac guy who gets 12 to 13 points, and we're looking at that as Sabonis gets used or that is a problem on a defensive end. Like my point is it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen any more than any other center in the league.
I would just say the majority of teams in the league, you watch them play and attack the Kings. The way they do it is putting Domas in pick and roll and trying to attack the basket and then spraying outside of that. Right? It's not that in terms of like taking what the defense gives you, like a lot of teams are just attacking the middle on the Kings. And that's just it is what it is.
My thing was they're attacking because they don't play good. No, they're attacking though. Like that's the thing. Attack them, not necessarily on the pick and roll. I mean, just a week ago we talking about how they attacked Kevin Huerter.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're attacking these guys who aren't playing defense on the perimeter. All of it always starts. People talk about the big man. In my opinion, it all starts with your guards and your wings and them playing defense. Your big man Rudy Gobert, he was great, but what he really did was he erased bad defense that was played on the perimeter by the Jazz. Your defense is only as good as what your perimeter players do. And that gets labeled as Sabonis' issue, but I think that's a perimeter player issue with the Kings, in my opinion.
I think it's both.
Okay.
Is that fair?
Who's the most important player on the Kings team?
In terms of what?
Who
terms of,
holds
like-
this whole thing together? Yeah, because we have these discussions. Obviously, Domas puts these incredible numbers. De'Aaron's still the best player, but a lot of people draw to Malik Monk. How Malik Monk is kind of the guy who ties this all together for this team.
So game in and game out, a Tuesday against Atlanta, during, the regular season, I would say it's probably Sabonis, right? Because he's your offensive hub. Like, he leads the team in touches. Whether or not De'Aaron's on the floor or not, he can run pick and roll with Monk. He can find the shooters. He can get his. But in a playoff series, it's Fox, because he's your bucket getter. He is your guy when, you're down 5 points with 3 minutes left. He's going to be the guy you go to get buckets. And I would say Monk is probably your second option in that scenario. So in terms of, like, who's valuable in those situations, in my opinion, I think it's Fox. And I think it's probably Monk, just in terms of just getting buckets, right? But in terms of, like, day to day, what you need in a random regular season game, when the stakes aren't nearly as high, I would say it's Sabonis, because he's everything you run your offense through. And I think, when it comes to those moments that the Kings are going to face, whether it's in the play-in or whether it's in the playoffs, it'll be De'Aaron having the ball in his hands and more than likely taking those key shots.
It's like patience versus urgency. Like you can run everything through Domas and be patient and see how it plays out. Where you get into a playoff series that you're talking about, it's like, well, let's not find out. Let's give the ball to our best player and let him do what he does, and that's De'Aaron Fox.
Yeah.
Or his partner at Kentucky to just pick up. Yeah,
if he's
let
doing
him
it
do
that
his
night,
thing.
you get it to that guy,
Yeah.
man. And that's the potential dynamic nature of this team. When they really, to me, when they get in their offensive bag, they got a lot of different ways they could beat you. And they have 3 guys that can take over a game, that can dominate a game. Fox, Monk, and Sabonis. Sabonis can do it on the boards, putbacks, the way he finishes around the basket, distributing the ball as well. But to me, that's got to be a scary thing for the playoffs. I think a lot of teams, if they're looking at it and being honest, kind of hoping the Kings fall out of the playoffs, don't make the play-in, and don't make the playoffs, because, like you mentioned, Chris, when you get to the playoffs, you need those bucket getters. 2 of the best bucket getters in the West are Fox and Monk, and then we all know what Sabonis is doing. That's a tough out, because I don't know if a lot of teams always have enough guys to match up with both of those 2 guys on the perimeter.
Which, I don't want to spin it forward too far, but to me, the biggest question facing the Kings is, like, you're going to have to pay Keegan at some point. You're obviously going to have to pay Monk this offseason. Is Vivek going to be willing to go into the tax? Like, are you going to have 4 guys making, pretty big money? And is that going to be able to work? Are you going to be able to build a competent roster around those 4 if you do indeed keep all 4 of those guys? And that's why the playoffs are going to be so interesting, because it's, if it's Fox and Monk, how are we going to come out of it thinking about Keegan, right? Like, or if Keegan takes a big step, then is it all right? Well, maybe we just bank on Keegan to continue to make his big step, and then use that money we would potentially re-sign Monk with elsewhere, right? Like, to me, there's a big question when it comes to, 3rd and 4th in the pecking order long term. And I know I'm zooming out and getting way ahead of myself here, but, like, that's one of the ownership questions you have with the Kings, right? Is when you have to pay all of these guys, are you going to be willing to? Because that's what it's going to take, honestly, if you're going to compete with, the Denvers and, who knows what Oklahoma City is going to look like going forward. Like, you have a lot of the contending teams who are well within the tax. Are the Kings going to be willing to go there? And that's going to be, the playoffs and how this season ends is going to be an interesting dynamic to keep track of in terms of that stuff.
Well, there sure as hell is no scenario where they don't offer Malik whatever they can offer him this offseason. There's no like, hey, let's go get this instead. It's like, nope, you get that right there.
Yeah, I would agree. I
was also just going to say, in the effort of fairness of speaking about these people with the same energy, our bad, we did not mention Keegan Murray today. We talk about him when he gets 3 points.
Yeah, we really did.
19 and 11 last night.
Yeah.
19 and 11.
And that's just the offensive end.
Yeah,
We
that's just the
so we
offensive
referenced a little bit earlier. He was part of the LeBron committee, right?
Mhm.
He had to guard LeBron at times last night, like Harrison did and De'Aaron did, and so on. But yeah, Keegan, who even acknowledged he wasn't 100% last night, but knew they were going to be shorthanded and want to get out there. Extremely effective.
Mhm.
Yeah, you're right. I think we spent so much time talking about Keon, a little bit about
And
Davion,
laughing at the Lakers.
and trash talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a lot of trash talking today. How would you evaluate? I do want to talk San Francisco 49ers with you, but how
Mhm.
would you evaluate Mike Brown in his second year? Like, obviously, expectations are different. Fans are a little bit more on edge. The season overall has just kind of been odd. How do you think Mike has done here this second year with the Kings?
One thing I keep going back to, and I think I say it to you guys every time I come on, is when Mike talks about, it's going to be harder in year 2 than it was in year 1. And when he says that over these last few weeks being around the team, I think he was kind of talking about his job too. Like his job is much more difficult now in year 2 than it was in year 1. And I think I think there's a battle that he has to deal with internally when it comes to playing to his team's strengths while also understanding its weaknesses, which also sort of goes against his overall ethos as a basketball coach, right? Like we know of Mike Brown as this defensive guy. He was the Warriors defensive guru, coordinator, whatever you want to call it. He's always had a defensive background as a coach. And he comes to a team that probably has a flawed roster when it comes to defense and probably wouldn't be built in the image that he would build a team if he had personnel power. So he's basically in charge of having an offense first roster, trying to get it to play good enough defense, while also understanding that the offensive stuff can be a little bit delicate, right? Like in the game against, I forget, it was Houston or Chicago, one of the losses they had at home. They had a really bad third quarter offensively, right? And we see him go into spells offensively where they really struggle. And I think the line of thinking would be, well, Mike's a defensive coach, they're not doing enough, offensive work. And based on what you hear, if you're around the team, like they work really hard on offensive stuff. They do more offensive drills in practice than they do defensive drills. And it's because it's Mike Brown kind of going through this adjustment of being a defensive coach, but understanding that for him to maximize the potential of this team, he needs it to fire on all cylinders offensively. He can't be taking away what they do offensively to try to improve defensively because he believes that they have a pretty limited ceiling in terms of what they can accomplish on that end of the floor. So it's been, I don't know if, like, I can't get inside Mike Brown's head and call it like an internal struggle, but I think it's an interesting dynamic in that he's a defensive guy who's coaching this offensive team, knowing that he has to get every ounce of what they have offensively for them to get as far as they're going to go, because their ceiling as an offensive team is much higher than it would be if he's really trying to drill down on defense and really trying to be a team that, allows opponents to score 105 points a game or whatever it would be, right? So I think it's an interesting dynamic to observe for sure, because you look at like the decision to play Keon Ellis or Kevin Huerter, like that's exactly where sort of that conflict falls, right? Is like, do you play Kevin Huerter, the guy who you've known to be a floor stretcher for you offensively, and who, when he's shooting well, can make you really, really dynamic? Or do you go with the guy who gives you a little bit more of an edge defensively in Keon, who, might give you more versatility on that end, and might raise what you are defensively, and maybe that gives you a better shot in the playoffs? I'm sure that's an internal discussion that the Kings are having. And when it comes to Mike Brown in his second year, that's what I find most interesting about it, is that there's this push and pull between, what he knows to be his basketball truths in terms of the importance of defense versus what his roster looks like as a roster that you really have to maximize offensively in order to raise its ceiling as high as possible.
Real quick on the Kings, Chris. What do you think about this team right now? It's almost an impossible question after what they've shown us throughout the year, but I think they're a good team. I think they will be a top 6 team. I think they will be more consistent down the stretch than what they've shown so far. What do you think about this team?
Yeah, I think since they've had the players only meeting when they were in Denver a couple weeks ago, I think that was a pivotal moment in their season. Because you'd hear them talk about consistency and urgency and all of those things. And when the Kings play with urgency, they can beat anybody. We've seen them beat really good teams. We've seen them beat Denver a bunch. We've seen them beat Oklahoma City a bunch. We know that the ceiling when they play their best ball, they can beat anybody in the NBA. But the big question with a young team is, can they do it consistently? And the bigger question going forward is, can they do it consistently in a 7-game series? And ultimately, like, I can't tell you I know, because none of these guys that they have proven it. And it's not a slight to them. It's just where they're at in their careers. Like, De'Aaron Fox doesn't have a whole lot of playoff experience. Domantas Sabonis' playoff experience is relatively limited. And these are your two guys who are your focal points. So that's one thing I know the Kings talk about a lot is just that they have people in new roles, and they're going to have to learn how to win. And learning how to win in the playoffs means going through it. And so, I can't say that I will know if how good the Kings are until I see them in the playoffs and in those situations. But I think they can be as good. They can't, like, it wouldn't surprise me at all if they won 2 playoff series, but it also wouldn't surprise me at all if they lost in the first round. Like, they're that type of team where they're so talented they can beat anybody, but they also sort of lack that experience and haven't gone through the things that a lot of these other teams have gone through, incrementally to get to the steps of being a championship team, because it doesn't come all at once. It's a building process, and they're still, I would say, relatively early in terms of what they're trying to build in terms of that playoff experience.
I want to make sure we steal a few minutes with Chris here to talk about the San Francisco 49ers. Of course, Chris covers the San Francisco 49ers, both for the Sacramento Bee and Candlestick Chronicles. Let's start with Arik Armstead. We find out he's headed to Jacksonville today. A great deal for him. Kenny and I had talked about this all throughout the year. Were you surprised that the 49ers and Arik weren't able to work things out, or did you kind of see this coming?
Yeah, I go back and forth. I don't know exactly what the pay cut was they were asking him to take. The 49ers, this is a team that traded DeForest Buckner, right? And so DeForest Buckner was sort of the model citizen, the guy that you sort of build around, the type of locker room presence that you prize as an organization. And they traded him because they said, well, we like Armstead, we have other pieces, blah, blah, blah. Point being, nobody is necessarily safe, right? And the thing is with Armstead, it's been kind of an availability issue. And it's been, he's missed a bunch of games with significant leg injuries the last 2 years. And he's having surgery this offseason, and he's 30 years old. And it's fair to say, like, yeah, you're probably not an $18 million a year guy for us right now, which I don't think the 49ers are wrong in saying necessarily. And I don't think Arik Armstead is wrong in saying I deserve better. I can get money elsewhere. Like, I'm not just going to take your pay cut. I'll go to Jacksonville and play for Trent Baalke, where, the guy who drafted me. And he still believes, and, obviously we don't know what the structure of that contract is yet, but 3 years, $51 million on its face. That's not bad. And it definitely looks like a lot more than the 49ers are willing to pay initially. So, I think it's just a hard truth of the NFL, and that, what's best for the team and what's best for the player don't always align. And, I think it's an unfortunate ending, because Armstead, in terms of like how he started and how he finished, Armstead started out sort of, fans were like, is this guy good? Is he a bust? Is he, too many injuries, blah, blah, blah. It turned out to be a really good player, and and played his best football in the playoffs. And, was a force for them. And I think deserves a ton of credit for that. Obviously the off the field stuff, like, I thought he should have won the Walter Payton Man of the Year award. I've covered some of his charitable stuff in Sacramento, and talked to him about that at pretty decent lengths. And, I think all that stuff is super commendable, and what he does for the community is second to none, of any athlete, frankly, I've ever covered. And I think he definitely deserves to be commended for that, given how many people he's touched, particularly within the Sacramento area. But, yeah, it's just an unfortunate truth of the league. Sometimes what's best for the team and what's best for the player don't align, and that's why you see divorces like this happen.
Yeah, it is unfortunate, man. And I know as a 49ers fan and a Sacramento native, I'm going to miss him being on the 49ers. Happy that, he's getting what he's looking for with Jacksonville. But, it is the business. It is the business of football. And it's unfortunate when you have a salary cap. Sometimes you got to do things to get under the salary cap. And there was no right answer in that situation for the 49ers. I'm sure they all love Arik as a person or whatever, but they had to do what they had to do. So that sucks. What else would suck is if Brandon Aiyuk wasn't with the 49ers again. What are you making of the noise coming out that the Jaguars are interested and he's interested, and some are even saying the 49ers are interested in what that may look like? Is that a situation where they want Brandon around, but at a certain number, and if he doesn't want that number, they may say, hey, well, if you don't want to be here for that number, we have to look to do what's best for our team as well.
It's kind of it makes me laugh a little bit because it's like a yearly tradition at this point. Like, which 49er due for the big contract is going to have some contentious negotiations, and is there going to be any public posturing, right? Like, the Deebo Samuel stuff was probably the peak of it. Like, Deebo, from what I've heard, was making it very clear he wasn't at all thrilled about the Niners situation, and then eventually came to an agreement on a contract, right? The George Kittle stuff was messy before he signed his contract. Nick Bosa obviously missed all of training camp last year before he signed his contract. So all of this stuff, this noise, the Jaguars are interested in a trade. Like, yeah, of course, any team would be interested in acquiring Brandon Aiyuk that isn't already loaded at receiver. So that definitely makes sense to me that would be out there. But until something actually happens and until rubber meets the road, I try not to read too much into this stuff because it is all a little bit of public posturing, and we've seen all this posturing happen. And in the vast majority of the time, it's led to a new contract with the 49ers. So whether that's, Kittle, Fred Warner, Nick Bosa, Deebo Samuel, Trent Williams, even, almost became a Kansas City Chief when he was a free agent a couple years ago. Like, it just gets tenuous, but I think the 49ers do deserve a little bit of credit because as tenuous as it's gotten, they figured out ways to get deals done and keep these guys in the fold. So I'm sure they have a breaking point in terms of, what Brandon Aiyuk would have to ask for them to say, yeah, we're not giving you that when we'd rather just trade you. But we don't know what that point is. And the only thing I would say about it, like, my expectation is Brandon Aiyuk is going to be a 49er, and maybe it's one of those contracts that happens in July or August after a holdout or whatever. But beyond this upcoming season in 2024, I don't see a world where Brandon Aiyuk and Deebo Samuel are both making top of the market money on the same team. And that's where it gets interesting. And frankly, like, there's been chatter about Deebo Samuel and all of that stuff. Like, it doesn't make any financial sense for the Niners to trade Deebo this offseason because there would be a huge dead cap penalty. But they do have an out after this upcoming season where it makes him a lot easier to trade, and he would only have 1 year left on his deal. He could go to a team that wanted to sign him to a new contract. But if the Niners agree to a deal with Brandon Aiyuk this offseason, they could in theory shrink his cap number from the $14 million that he would make on his 5th-year option, have it be around 5 or 6, which is typically what they've done with their big contracts, and then have that escalate and get bigger as time goes on, which would make it so, after 20 or going into 2025, that's when it might be difficult to be paying, Deebo Samuel is 28 million or whatever it would be, and Brandon Aiyuk in that same ballpark. So for this season, I would say I'm pretty confident that Brandon Aiyuk and Deebo Samuel will be on the 49ers and that Brandon Aiyuk is going to sign an extension. But beyond that, I would say, it seems more likely than not, in my opinion, that the Niners do not have both guys in 2025.
Good start to the offseason for San Francisco. Bad start, indifferent start.
I mean, it's funny that the only guys that they've signed are all defensive linemen.
Well, then you had the Eric Hendricks situation,
that wasn't great, but at least for them, I think they feel comfortable in that they can, as good as Dre Greenlaw was, they feel like they can replicate, what he gives them in other ways without breaking the bank on a linebacker. So I think Kendricks probably went to the Cowboys knowing he would have more playing time and that there wasn't somebody like Dre Greenlaw ready to take his playing time away from him. I would imagine there was that, and on top of the financial component. But yeah, I think it's been fine. I think Leonard Floyd is a really good addition. I think he's probably the best defensive end who's been opposite Nick Bosa that the Niners have had. D Ford had a really good impact when he was healthy, and that pass rush was lethal when D Ford was healthy. But his back and hamstrings were so problematic at that point that he just wasn't on the field enough. And then so you look at what Leonard Floyd brings, really good run player, I think he's the best player the Niners have had opposite Nick Bosa at defensive end. So I think that's really good. In terms of losing Armstead, that's tough, obviously. Yetur Gross-Matos, we'll see if he can play inside at all. But yeah, I think it's been fine. I try not to get too wrapped up in free agency because usually the worst teams are the ones who are most active in free agency.
For sure. Chris, we appreciate you as always, man. Thank you for spending so much time on us. We'll be locked in here with the Sacramento Bee and Candlestick Chronicles and be visiting again soon.
Of course, guys. Appreciate you as